John Gilroy here. Although this is a technology podcast, today we are going to delve into something strange. Human beings. When humans try to complete a task on a website, it's called user experience. Today, Thelma Van from Excella will put the U in user experience. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. This is the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. We're going to discuss a topic that's very important in the federal government. It's called user experience. In fact, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I submit to you in front of me a document dated December 13th, 2021 that talks about an executive order on transforming federal customer experience and service delivery to rebuild trust in government. So this topic of user experience, UX, is not some kind of a narrow focus topic. It's very important for many, many agencies. We want to bring in someone like Thelma, who's been there, done that, got the T-shirt, has all kind of experience, and maybe explain some of the principles behind user experience and maybe how your agency can benefit from that. So, Thelma, we're just going to jump right in here, and we're just going to go for it, okay? So, let's say you're working for an agency and you're listening to Thelma Van on the Federal Tech Podcast. So how can they use user experience and human-centered design to deliver better digital experiences for everybody?
Yeah, great question, John. So I think one of the very first key steps for agencies when they're thinking about UX and leveraging human-centered design principles for their agency to create better websites, platforms, products, one of the things that is really key is to really think about investing in design infrastructure. And, you hear that word invest and immediately people think cost or they think money. But really what I'm talking about is key infrastructure in order to optimize user experience. So that means investing in things like research, understanding your users. Who are you building these sites for? Who are the personas that are using these sites? So that's how one way that agencies can really begin to think about implementing UX inside of their agency.
So everyone asks about steps. What's the next step? What's the first step? What's the last step? What step did you trip on? So let's talk about steps here. So what are the foundational steps here for my listeners to improve the user experience in this whole thing called human-centered design?
Yeah, I think one of the very first steps is understanding the problem, right? What is the problem that you are trying to solve? So a lot of times when you go and you visit a website, it is unclear about what it is that you actually need to do or what it is that the user is there for, right? So you want to start to problem frame when you're thinking about your product teams and building the technology. So what I mean by that specifically is step one would be to run a workshop. Right. So this can be internally to a team where you are exploring what is the problems that we're trying to solve. But to extend that and to really get to the heart of the matter is you want to start interviewing end users. You want to start going out, talking to people who utilize your sites. And I want to make sure that it's not just your website that's important, but also the products that people are using, right? I want to start step number one, conduct interviews. If you already have an existing site or product, you can do things like conduct usability testing. And this doesn't have to be a large effort. There are studies out there that show that even just talking to 5 people can drastically improve usability. So that's step number one. Step number two is then how do you synthesize the information that you've just gotten, right? So a lot of times you'll see a gap between interviewing and understanding the problem and then translating that into actual functional requirements, right? That developers are then building. So really that place in between, that sweet spot of taking what users are saying their pain points are, the problems they have, and then really translating that is a key part that often gets missed. So you want to take the time and make sure that you're translating those. And there are a number of frameworks to do that, which I won't go into all of them today, but there are a number of things. And then I think that the after you have sort of built maybe something, right? And that's where usability testing comes in. Making sure that you are validating, did we understand what we heard from the user in those interviews? Is that something that we have translated correctly into working software? And then really kind of that final thing and is really thinking about things as a system and building feedback loops so that it's not a once and done thing. We are humans. We change, our lives change, our goals change, our needs change. And so really making sure that you're creating a framework that is constantly looking at user needs.
So Thelma, in the mundane world of marketing, they use something called a heat map. And I've got a heat map on my company website, and I can see where people click and see what's popular, what's not. Is that even part of the discussion, or is that just marketing only, or where's this fit in this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about, let's take a step back, and I talked about usability, right? So when we think about the tools of conducting usability, you have things like heat maps, right? Where you can actually see where users are clicking, you can understand where they're going. There are actual usability tests where you can go out and talk to the user, show them, have them click through where you're getting information. There's things like Google Analytics, right, where you can see the path that users are going. There are other tools like A/B testing, right, to ensure that you are presenting alternatives. So that really kind of fits within sort of that qualitative and quantitative research around usability.
A few years back, there's a movie that made this phrase real popular. It was called The Need for Speed. If you remember Tom Cruise saying that years ago.
Yes.
And so let's talk about the need for speed. You mentioned Google, so I'm going to run with Google. What Google says is that if someone pulls out their phone, it takes more than 3 seconds for a page to load, they're going to bounce. So Marketing 101 says you better make that page fast for a better user experience. So let's put the speed hat on your head there, put a speed baseball cap on. And so is this part and parcel of the discussion? It's like this website's just too slow. I mean, does that come up?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, working with several federal agencies where their products are loading slow, that is a critical pain point, right? So really optimization is fundamental to the user experience. So when I go and I visit a site, I may only have a short amount of time to complete the form or to do what it is that I need to do on that site. And if it's loading slowly, I start my process already at a point of frustration, right? Before I even finish what it is that I need to do. So I think that that's really key to making sure that things are loading in an efficient manner. Now, sometimes there are situations where there is a lot of data to load and it might be slow. And that's where one of those things that you can use as either breaking that up and creating like steps for the user. You can do things like loading so they understand that something is happening, right? Which we understand that sometimes there are things that load a little bit slower.
Yeah, that's good to know. Start off discussion with saying, no, this is very important, but this is top of mind in the federal government today. I mean, this is not just hey, in late December, we have a couple minutes free, we'll talk. No, this is really top of mind. In fact, one of my colleagues, a guy by the name of Justin Doubleday over at Federal News Network, he interviewed Dana Chisnell from DHS. And would they view it, and they view usability as someplace, is it easy? They use user UX experience as something that's a big burden. It's a burden reduction tool. That's what they're returning. Yeah, it's a burden reduction tool. So what this does is people get on site, they try to fill out a form, they get frustrated, they leave, and they come back. And if it's a day, what if it's something important? And so I think I never have used it as Is that important? But it really is important for many agencies, isn't it? It's a priority.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about, especially, I like to use the pandemic because we all just, it's a central point. We all understand the burden we all faced during that period. But a lot of things transitioned to digital experiences, right? A lot of paper forms went away. And so people were entering these digital experiences that were not ideal, and that were challenging. And so if you think about the cognitive load that people are already facing, right, in their day-to-day lives, and then you add on top of that a poor user experience that adds to that burden, that is a real challenge. And you think about the reasons why somebody is visiting an agency, whether it's to complete a form or whether it's to get a task completed. It's generally not a simple matter, right? It is something they really need that's going to impact their life. So yeah, reducing that burden is really important.
Well, we don't have users on this podcast. We have listeners. And if people are listening to this podcast and are interested more about Thelma Van and her company Excella, you can go to federaltechpodcast.com, go to the search bar and pop in Excella. You'll get 2 or 3 interviews with 2 or 3 different aspects about improving federal government experience with information technology. So it's a good company, and we've had you on in the past before. And federaltechpodcast.com. Pretty soon they'll be able to search Thelma and get up to this interview, huh?
Absolutely.
So speaking of look things up, I did some research for this interview. I looked up some minor little detail from the federal government called the Paperwork Reduction Act. I mean, it seems like, Thelma, this is a perfect storm to have you working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. I mean, the Paperwork Reduction Act, executive order, and the people from the DHS beating the drum. And a lot of people are looking at the DHS as a model for improving their handling of paper. So but we're getting to the point where this is going to be, it's costing the government money if there's forms that not filled out correctly, or people bail, or it's incorrect. So it's really a high priority.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about the PRA, or Paperwork Reduction Act, amongst any things. And that's one of the things when the executive order came out in 2021, you saw a lot of webinars pop up around that topic specifically, because I talk about, going out and interviewing and making sure, right, that you're talking to the people that your site is built for or your product is built for. But there are some things in the Paperwork Reduction Act that sometimes limits our capability and ability to do that, right? We don't also want to create another burden for people. So there are things that, agencies can do to get around that, and making sure that they have a well planned out research plan, that they're working with agencies like GSA and others to get to a point where that they can talk and interview. As you mentioned, reducing the burden and having these forms, paper forms, and reducing the amount of paper. We were working on a project specifically, for my UCIS. And when we were interviewing people, they were talking about their lack of awareness of completing the wrong form. They didn't know a form was deprecated, right? And that's one of the main issues with paper forms. They didn't realize that they were completing the wrong form, and then it went into a black hole. They didn't hear anything. And so really that's a burden again on the user, but also on the agency, because now they have to reach out, contact, let this person know you filled out the wrong form. Please fill out the right form, all the way around, from the people who are providing the service to the users who are actually completing the forms. It is a burden.
When I introduced this interview today, I facetiously referred to humans and everything else. Let's get back to these human beings. They're a pain, but we got to talk about them somehow. You talked about developing teams and interviewing 5 people or more. The woman I just mentioned, Dana from DHS, what her suggestion is that when you go to Ultra website, what you want to do is involve as many stakeholders as possible. says get as many in the room as you possibly can. And I'm a big believer in that because when I do my web, I didn't realize the thing was misspelled. I didn't see it. Sometimes you get so wrapped up in the code, you don't notice the obvious. And someone from the back room is going to go, look at this, it's Thelma with two L's. It's just one in there, but you're not going to notice it, are you? So this whole big involvement, and that's nice to say, but how do you structure it? How do you get all those birds to fly in formation and work on the design?
Yeah, I think collaboration is a key point of human-centered design process, right? I would say the first step is honestly pre-planning, right? Knowing what it is, setting expectations, and also the outcomes is super critical. I think the other thing is this is post project, right? But when you are starting a project, identifying those key stakeholders up front, inviting them early to be part of that process, right? So if your project is to optimize a site, one of the key things you would want to do is identify those stakeholders. So that could be policymakers, that can be developers, that could be, end users. So bringing all those individuals together in a well thought out workshop is key and critical to getting those insights from various perspectives. Because like you said, somebody might be stronger in spelling, but beyond that, having that developer there as well can also provide input on the technology that's used, the technology limitations. What do we need to change? Policymakers can give that view of, here's what the policy says. Here are the things we can and cannot say. So I think it is key. And one of the ways that you do that is engage early, right? And also often, as we say in Agile, right?
So Thelma, 2 years ago, I was in a classroom and one of my graduate students walked up to me and I met him and he handed me his business card. He worked for Deloitte and had UI UX on it. So if they handed that to you, you'd know what it meant. If they handed it to Jeff Gallimore, and there are some people that may not be in the in crowd and understand the terminology. And I like the idea. I think the way you present things verbally is very good. And I think if you can have a shared language or shared goals, I think this really breaks down a lot of the barriers. Oh, that Thelma's real smart. She's these big fans. No, it's not a big fan. It's just we're trying to work things out. And so this is part of working with people, isn't it? Having a shared language.
Yeah, absolutely. I critical. I like to say that every industry has their buzzwords that they use, right? In Agile, fast Agile, you might say a discovery tree, and people are like, "What is that?"
Yeah.
Um, and the same is true of UI UX. I think having that shared or starting with that shared language, helping everybody in the room understand what these principles are or how they relate to something that they might be familiar with. Like I use the term early and often, right? Collecting feedback early and often. That's a shared language, even among Agile experts, right? So making sure that we are using language in a way that is understandable by everyone. But at the same time, we know that there are terms that we use that people do not know. And so wanting to do our very best to explain those up front in the process so that we all have the same shared understanding. Because I've seen this time and time again, especially when it comes to maybe a journey map. Let's just use that term. There are some people who view that one way, have an understanding of what that looks like, or even user flow, like those type of terms. People have already a preconceived idea, even amongst designers. So just coming and saying collectively, what do we mean by that term? What are our assumptions around them?
Thelma, my wife is a principal in high school, and the term evaluate's a hot button in our house. We talk about evaluation a lot. In fact, you can get a whole master's degree in testing and evaluation. That's just a master, just in that alone. And so when it comes to user design, okay, you gotta report to Janet's office and give her a report today there, Thelma. So how do you evaluate progress in user design? It seems difficult to evaluate.
So I think there's one way that you can evaluate progress, and I think it's ensuring that your outcomes are aligned with the mission of the federal agency or digital initiatives, right? So upfront, if you are defining the outcomes of the design, you've already identified your problems. You can measure user feedback, right? You can measure whether or not you have solved those problems. However, if you don't start with problem framing and you don't start defining your outcomes and you haven't really done that upfront work, then yes, it can be difficult. But if you've done those things up front, you can start to build around benchmarks even. This is another key point is you can do comparative benchmarks. So you can look at what was the site before and now what is the site, what is the user satisfaction. These are all things that we can measure.
In public speaking, a classic formula for a speech is here's where I was, here's where I'm at, here's how I got there. I think you can steal that from me, Thelma. I mean, you can go into an agency and say, okay, here's where we were, if you remember, and here's where we are, and then here's how we got. Because I think human beings, the theme of the show is humans being as they are, they're going to forget it took, an hour to do this and you're doing it in 3 minutes now. It's just natural with humans. You almost have to remind them of the process, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. But like I said before, if you don't start here, if you don't actually document, here was where we are. Like you said, people forget.
Yeah.
People forget from meeting to meeting,
Yeah.
let alone a whole entire project.
And in my world, in marketing, they do surveys, and I think surveys are kind of overblown now. But the theory is you get in touch with your audience that way, and so I prefer gamifying something, and that seems to get better results for me. And so, how do you? Okay, you start January 1st. Okay, now 4th of July rolls around, and so how do you get feedback? Is it surveys? Is it people actually making telephone calls to users? How do you get the feedback on the changes?
Yeah, I think it's qualitative or quantitative. So qualitative, you could use metrics. You can understand, as we talked about before, you can look at your heat maps. You can see are people more engaged with a particular area of the product or site. The other way that you can get feedback is literally conducting interviews, as I mentioned. You can do surveys, right? I know, like you said, surveys might seem overblown, but there are still people who love to complete surveys. Maybe because I'm in the industry, if somebody sends me a survey, I generally complete it.
Yeah.
I think that setting up those mechanisms, as I talked about before, the infrastructure of collecting feedback, doing that first, and it should not be one singular channel. It really does need to be multi-channel. So, like I mentioned, qualitative and quantitative as well methods.
When I interview people in the area of cybersecurity, there's a phrase that pops up, and the phrase is cross-functional. When I interview people about software bill of materials, it talks about cross-functional. When I talk to people about satellites, it's cross. So I think there's no bubble here. There's not Thelma and the director of the agency sitting in a corner figuring everything out. It's more like Thelma's everywhere and everyone's everywhere. And it's not just users. It could be other software developers or other teams that are invested in this website as well. So I think this cross-functional thing is real important. People forget about that.
Yeah, I think people do tend to forget about cross-functionality. One of the dangers sometimes in design processes is that designers will go off, they'll define problems on their own, they'll bring it back to the team, and they'll come back with an entire process, wireframes, prototypes, whatever it is, on their own. That is a real danger. However, being cross-functional means, as we talked about before, involving all of those stakeholders, involving your developers, involving everyone from the start, right? So that everyone is understanding the problem, which means you result in a shared language and shared understanding of what that problem is. And the other thing is that most of the time people think that human-centered design principles are only for designers, right? The designers are the ones who understand this stuff, but really human-centered design principles, optimizing user experience is everyone's responsibility, right? Everyone should be thinking about that. Everyone should understand the principles. In the same way you brought up cybersecurity. Even as a UX professional, these are things that I need to understand and know as I'm thinking about building and crafting solutions for end users. So it is important that we have cross-functional understanding and collaboration.
Well, Thelma, I don't want to repeat myself and pound this into the ground, but I think there are agencies out there, maybe larger agencies, that have centers of excellence just focused on human-centered design. I mean, this is if you want to study stuff in school, this is really an important thing to study. I mean, I've seen more and more agencies getting involved in it. And have you worked with any of these centers of excellence? I think CMS has one.
CMS, I think, does have one. I think OBM has one. There are a number of agencies. I have had an opportunity to work with them where they do have sort of that centralized hub. However, what we are also seeing in addition to that sort of centralized hub is embedded designers, right, on teams, specifically on Scrum teams or product teams. So there is like sort of layer of shared understanding, a center of excellence, and then also these embedded designers who are helping with the day-to-day, right, getting that product released.
There's vocabulary. When you said Scrum, I said, "Oh, Thelma plays rugby. Wow, this should be interesting."
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I have a telegram in front of me from the White House, and it mandates me I have to say artificial intelligence with every interview. So I have no choice here. It's executive order just for John Gilroy. So what role does artificial intelligence have in human-centered design?
Well, that is a great question. I think that the role is interesting. There's two ways that you can look at this. You can look at a human-centered design as informing AI products, right? Recently, I have been running workshops that help agencies actually identify pain points and where AI can actually solve these areas, right? Where can we actually optimize and use AI as an accelerator, right? Not to replace human, but how do we accelerate some of these mundane tasks, right? Finding those pain points is the sweet spot for human-centered design experts, right? We understand where to find them, and running workshops to do that. On the other side, where we see AI is we talk about research. Research is intensive, or can be, especially if you're conducting these one-on-one interviews, and synthesizing all of that information can be time consuming, right? So designers there are tools out there that already exist, but designers can also leverage AI to do sort of some of that sentiment analysis, or even quickly identify themes that they're seeing in their research. So it's twofold, for sure.
Yeah, I think sentiment analysis might be a good application for some artificial intelligence principles here. Well, we've had a terrific interview. If you'd like to know more about Thelma's company, you can go to excella.com. And this is great. Thank you very much for your time, Thelma. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I was your moderator. I'd like to thank our guest, Thelma Van, UX Innovation Civil Design Product Designer for Excella.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.